The glowing red numbers on the bedside alarm clock read 3:14 a.m., a time Alina had come to dread more than any other. Beside her, the mattress shifted, releasing a long, suppressed sigh that signaled the beginning of the ritual. For 42 years, Alina had laid in the dark, feigning sleep, listening to the man she loved more than life itself slip out from under the quilt. She knew the routine by heart, the soft click of his knees, the hesitation before his feet touched the cold hardwood, and the stealthy, almost ghostly exit from their bedroom. To the outside world, Frank was the pillar of their community in Granite Falls, a retired foreman, a deacon at the First Baptist Church, a man who fixed neighbors' fences for free. But to Alina, in the dead of night, he was a stranger carrying a burden so heavy it seemed to bend the very shadows of the hallway around him. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. Tonight, the heavy, metallic scent of iodine that usually vanished by morning was already lingering in the air, and Alina knew she could no longer be a spectator to her husband's private purgatory. Their life together had been a tapestry of quiet joys woven through the decades. They met in 1961 at a diner in Spokane, where Alina was a waitress and Frank was a young, ambitious shift lead at the chemical plant. He was handsome in a rugged, serious way, with eyes that smiled even when his mouth didn't. They married 6 months later. It was a good marriage, built on shared values and a deep, abiding respect. They raised 3 children, paid off the mortgage, and weathered the economic storms that battered the Pacific Northwest. Yet, there was always a part of Frank that was walled off, a fortress Alina was silently forbidden to breach. The oddities began in the early 70s, specifically after the accident Frank never liked to discuss. He had come home from the hospital after a 3-week stay, claiming he had broken ribs and suffered smoke inhalation during a minor sight malfunction. But the man who returned was changed. He became modest to the point of obsession. He never swam with the children. He wore undershirts and button-downs, even in the stifling August heat. He locked the bathroom door not just to shower, but to change his clothes. And then the nightly pilgrimages began. Every single night, between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m., Frank would go down to the detached workshop in the backyard. He told Alina it was his insomnia, that he liked to whittle or organize his tools to quiet his mind. For decades, she forced herself to believe him because trusting him was easier than confronting the terror of the unknown. But the years have a way of eroding patience, and love, when tested by silence, eventually demands the truth. The catalyst wasn't a sudden outburst, but a slow accumulation of small, terrifying details. In recent months, Alina noticed Frank's gait had stiffened. He flinched when she hugged him too tightly around the midsection. The laundry, which she had done for 40 years, started to reveal secrets. She found traces of yellowish fluid on his undershirts and small, dried spots of blood near the hem of his pajamas. When she asked about his back pain, he would brush it off with a forced smile, blaming arthritis or old man aches. But arthritis didn't smell like antiseptic, and it didn't require an hour of solitude in a freezing workshop every morning. On this particular Tuesday in November, the wind was howling off the mountains, rattling the window panes. Eleanor listened as Frank's truck boots crunched softly on the gravel outside, heading toward the workshop. She waited 5 minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She threw off the covers, grabbed her heavy wool robe, and slid her feet into her slippers. The decision had been made. She wasn't going to spy. She was going to save him, though she didn't yet know from what. She navigated the kitchen in the dark, the linoleum cold beneath her feet. Through the window, she saw the faint, yellow glow of the workshop window. It was a sacred space, Frank's sanctuary. Stepping out into the biting wind, she clutched the lapels of her robe tight. The walk to the shed felt like miles. As she reached the door, she hesitated. The handle was cold iron. She knew that turning it might shatter the peace they had maintained for half a lifetime. But she also knew that a peace built on hidden agony was no peace at all. She took a breath that tasted of pine and coming snow, and she opened the door. The scene inside was not one of a hobbyist tinkering with wood. The air was thick, hot from a space heater cranked to its highest setting, and heavy with the smell of medicinal ointment and raw flesh. Frank was standing with his back to her, facing a large workbench he had converted into a makeshift medical station. He was stripped to the waist. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream, but a small, strangled gasp escaped her throat. Frank spun around, his eyes wide with a primal panic, grabbing a towel to cover himself, but it was too late. Eleanor had seen. His torso, from his left shoulder down to his hip, was a landscape of ruin. It looked as though his skin had been melted and fused back together by a careless god. Thick, ropey keloid scars twisted around his ribs like vines. There were patches of raw, red skin that looked ulcerated, weeping fluid, where the old scar tissue had cracked and refused to heal. It was a map of violence, a secret history written in the language of burns and grafts. "Ellie, no, don't look," Frank rasped, his voice cracking, stepping back into the shadows. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him, stripped of his dignity, a frightened boy in an old man's body. "Go back to the house. Please." Eleanor didn't leave. She closed the door behind her to shut out the wind and stepped into the suffocating heat of the room. Tears blurred her vision, not from revulsion, but from a heartbreak so acute it felt physical. She walked toward him, ignoring his outstretched hand that tried to ward her off. "Frank," she whispered, the name carrying all the tenderness of their 4 decades together. "My God, Frank, why?" He slumped against the workbench, the towel clutching his chest, his head bowing in defeat. I didn't want you to see. I didn't want you to be disgusted. Disgusted? Alina reached out and touched his good shoulder. I am your wife. I have held your children. I have washed your clothes. Do you think this, she gestured to his side, changes who you are to me? It's ugly, Ellie. It's monstrous, he said, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. And it's my fault. The confession hung in the air. Alina gently took the towel from his shaking hands. Sit down, she commanded softly. He obeyed, sitting on the stool he had used for thousands of nights alone. She picked up the gauze and the jar of salve that sat on the table. Tell me the truth. No more stories about broken ribs. And so, as the wind battered the wooden walls of the shed, Frank finally purged the poison he had carried since 1971. He told her about the night at the plant. It wasn't a minor malfunction. It was a catastrophic pressure valve failure in the mixing sector. The company had been cutting corners on safety equipment to save money. When the alarm sounded, Frank hadn't run out. He had run back in to manually seal the breach to prevent the gas from reaching the town, to prevent it from reaching the neighborhood where Alina and their babies were sleeping. I got the valve closed, Frank said, his voice trembling. But the pipe burst just as I finished. It sprayed me with the chemical slurry. It was boiling, Ellie. It ate through the suit in seconds. He explained the aftermath. The company lawyers had descended on his hospital bed before he could even speak. They offered a settlement, a massive sum that paid for their house, the kids' college, their secure retirement. But it came with a non-disclosure agreement and a threat. If he spoke about the negligence, they would tie him up in litigation for years, bankrupt him, and destroy his reputation. They convinced him that his scarring was his burden to bear, and that he was lucky to be alive. I took the money, Frank wept, the shame convulsing his shoulders. I took the money to keep us safe, but I felt like I sold my soul. And every day this, he pointed to the weeping wounds on his side, reminds me that I'm a fraud. I walk around town, and people shake my hand, and they don't know I'm rotting underneath. Alina listened, her heart breaking and reforming with a newfound strength. She realized then that the nightly ritual wasn't just about tending to physical wounds. It was a penance. He was punishing himself for surviving, for taking the silence money, for feeling unworthy of the life he had provided for them. You are not a fraud, Alina said firmly. She dipped her fingers into the salve, the smell of wintergreen rising between them. You ran back in. You saved the town. You saved us. The scars aren't a mark of shame, Frank. They are a badge of honor that you bought with your own flesh. She moved behind him, leaned forward. For the first time in 42 years, Frank let go. He leaned forward, exposing the angry, inflamed skin to his wife. Alina's hands, usually busy with knitting or gardening, became the hands of a healer. She applied the ointment with a touch as light as a feather, tracing the ridges of the scars that had defined his life. She cleaned the open sores with fresh gauze, working in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a profound, vibrating intimacy. When she touched a particularly raw spot near his hip, Frank hissed in pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's okay," he breathed out, his shoulders dropping inches as the tension left his body. "It feels better. It feels better than doing it alone." They spent an hour in the shed. Alina bandaged him with a precision she didn't know she possessed. When they were finished, she helped him put on his flannel shirt, buttoning it for him like she used to do for their children. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the storm still raging outside, but the storm inside Frank finally beginning to break. The next morning, the change in the house was palpable. It wasn't that the scars were gone, they would never truly vanish, but the wall was down. Frank sat at the breakfast table, and for the first time, he didn't look like a man guarding a fortress. He looked tired, yes, but light. That night, and every night for the next 10 years, the alarm clock didn't need to ring. Alina would wake up when Frank stirred. She would get out of bed, put on her robe, and they would go downstairs together. They moved the medical supplies to the main bathroom, reclaiming the house from the secrecy. Alina learned the names of the creams, the right way to wrap the compression bandages, and the signs of infection to watch for. It became their time. At 3:30 a.m., while the rest of the world slept, they talked. They talked about the things they had missed in the silence, his fears of mortality, her worries about the grandchildren, the color of the paint for the porch. The intimacy of tending to his wounds surpassed any physical closeness they had shared in their youth. It was a communion of souls, a daily affirmation that he was seen, flaws and all, and that he was loved not in spite of them, but including them. Frank passed away in his sleep at the age of 79, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work. At the funeral, the church was packed. People spoke of his kindness, his generosity, his stoicism. They called him a pillar of the community. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands resting in her lap, feeling the ghost of his warm, rough palm in hers. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, Eleanor went upstairs. She opened the bathroom cabinet. The jar of salve was still there, half empty. She picked it up, inhaling the sharp scent of wintergreen one last time. She didn't cry for the pain he had suffered. She cried for the 40 years he had suffered it alone. But beneath the grief, there was a fierce, burning gratitude. She was grateful she had opened that door. She was grateful she had seen the ruin and called it love. She realized then that the greatest act of courage wasn't running into the chemical fire. It was letting someone else see the burns. Frank had finally allowed himself to be known, and in doing so, he had given Alina the greatest gift of their marriage, the truth. She placed the jar back on the shelf and closed the cabinet door, not with a slam, but with a gentle click. The secret was over. The healing was complete. And as she looked out the window at the dark, silent workshop, Alina knew that while the scars remained, the ghost had finally been laid to rest.